I'm guessing, since you're listening to this podcast, that you think philanthropy is important. I certainly do. I've been in the charitable sector for 20 years now and continue to be fascinated by the variation of the types of givers out there, the places they give, the way the different charities work. It's really a rich tapestry of groups and people and ideas. But in our daily lives, we don't really talk too much about philanthropy, or at least most people don't, which is why it's exciting when things like the Giving USA report come out, because it does give us a nice tentpole around which we can talk about philanthropy, talk about what is going on. Like a thermometer, it tells us how we're doing as a nation in terms of our giving. And the most recent report would suggest that we are doing pretty good. We having given away more than $600 billion amongst individuals and foundations and corporations and bequests back in 2025. And that sounds like a big number, but you have to know what it really means, what it's telling us, what it is compared to, and how does it break down? There are fractures in there that we have to explore. And so we're going to look at that today. And we're also going to couple that with a new report from the Philanthropy Roundtable that is called the Free to Give Index and is analyzed every state to figure out how hard or easy it is to let charities just be charities and to run charities and to give in these different states. So with those two pieces as guides, I want to explore the legislative and regulatory landscape of philanthropy today. And while saying legislative and regulatory doesn't sound necessarily all that titillating, it's really important. It's really important for how we give, our ability to give, and your ability as a philanthropist to have the impact that you want to have. So joining me to have that discussion are two great talents and great friends. Claudia Cummings is the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at the Philanthropy Roundtable. And before that, spent many years leading the umbrella organization for philanthropies in Indiana. And then Matthew Mitchell is the Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian-based think tank. And he directs the Center for Human Freedom. He's also a scholar at Mercatus, where he was full-time prior to being at Fraser. Claudia, Matt, so good to see you both.
Thanks for letting me be here.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start, Claudia, looking at the Giving USA report. So give us the big highlights. Is 618 million or billion, roughly that, is that a good number? What does it mean?
Yeah. Well, 617 billion is the number I have, but somewhere around there, whatever it is, it's more than the 600 billion that was given in the prior year. So we're up. It's 3% up, adjusted for inflation. And so that shows that people are really giving. They're giving more, and they are giving freely. I think a few key things jump out to me on this. I think individuals still drive giving. Nearly 2/3 of all charitable giving comes from everyday Americans. They're making choices about what they value and how they want to see society. And I think that's important and uniquely American. I think another big top line from this is that bequests are way up, almost 20% in a single year. We can talk about that, I'm guessing, further on into the podcast, but I think that's a huge highlight and headline. Lots of thoughts on that. Is it the baby boomers coming to a certain age? Is it the growth in the stock market? Is it some other factor out there? Really interesting question to see what happens over the next few years. And so I'll stop there, but there's a lot of interesting tidbits throughout the report.
Well, that bequest piece I do actually think is really interesting. And we've been hearing for years of this great wealth transfer. And back when I first heard about it many years ago, it was like there was going to be a $37 trillion, and then it was like a $60 trillion, and now it's like $93 trillion. I mean, it's only getting bigger. And yet, even as time passes, that transfer doesn't seem to be happening. Does the fact that the bequest giving is up mean that we're finally here, that this great wealth transfer is occurring, or is it just an anomaly?
It's such a huge number. I think it's an outlier, and we'll need to see. Giving USA gives us the data, but I don't know that we know for sure. I do think also we're living in that K-shaped economy right now, and we're seeing a lot of wealth grow significantly. And so that also is an important factor, I believe.
Now, I don't know if you've unpacked this, but I remember a couple of years ago, one of the big takeaways from the Giving USA numbers, kind of the underlying problem that people could see is that, yes, the individual giving was way up, but it was being driven by those mega gifts, the Bezos and Gates and McKinsey Scotts and, just people who could give significant amount of money versus, and you were actually starting to see a decline in the lower end of givers. Do you, as you've looked at the research, do you still see that? Is that still a concern, or is that still something y'all are talking about at the Philanthropy Roundtable?
Yeah, that is a multi-year trend now. I think we can say safely that small donors are down. I think a few promising pieces of light that are really important are that religion remains the largest share of charitable dollars at 23%. So a lot of folks, that's their primary source of giving, and it remains a significant place where individual donors are showing up and giving. I also think that when dollars are tight, the universal charitable tax deduction is important. And we've gone through a period recently where it's on again, off again. Folks can't keep track of that bouncing ball. And finally, last year, Congress, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, put it back on again long term. And so I'm hopeful that we will see those small dollars and those individual donors come back to the table and continue with the generosity that we know Americans
That's
are
and
known for.
it's not a big number. It's what, it's $1,000.
It's smaller than it has been sometimes. I can't recall the exact specifics on it, but I do think it's important. It tells people that your giving matters, and those signals, and we're going to talk about signals when we get to Matt. I think those signals really matter a lot to folks. I think that it's important. I'm also interested, another thing in Giving USA, it talks about education, and it's one of the bigger winners, up about
It was a huge
12%.
bump in the education
I
giving.
expect to
Yeah.
see that number go up even more in 2027. The $1,700 federal tax credit scholarship, that scholarship is going to be basically free money. It's a credit that any American can use to give to an educational K-12 institution of their choice. It can be used for tutoring, school supplies, a whole number of things. And I think that's another place where we're going to see individual giving kind of perk up and everyday Americans engage.
Well, that's a great point. I hadn't really, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about that tax credit because it's a big deal, but I hadn't really thought about it in terms of what it might do to the charitable numbers in terms of just the optics. But you're right. All that money's going to 501c3 scholarship granting organizations. So it's going to get counted in that way. I was thinking of it as a tax credit, and so therefore it's different. But you're absolutely right. You're right. You should see, and hopefully we'll see more money going into that than, to alma maters and annual funds at universities where it's maybe not necessarily looked at as good. All right, one more question, and I'm sure there's so much more we can unpack on this, and we'll circle around to it. But I also want to talk about this free to give index and how it matters. But one more question around the fact that the foundation giving doesn't really, it grew at what, 1%? I can't remember if that was the 1% real or 1% actual dollars, et cetera. But it didn't grow much. And I kind of expected that because of the positive stock market to have actually gone up, because there's always a 5% floor of what they can give. So you would think that if the economy goes up, the foundations have to give more. Why do you think the foundations don't seem to be keeping the growth there? Doesn't seem to be, at least to my novice eyes, keeping up with the broader growth of the assets.
Yeah, the growth was still at a record number. It was $117 billion. So that's not chump change. I do think that it's up a bit year over year, and it's up a little bit over that 5%. And I think that it's that because it's up a little bit over that, not much, you're right, but still up. And I think that does continue to show that payouts are strategic. They're long term plays. Foundations tend to work directly with their charities, they know their charities. They work towards specific goals. And I think that it is not a negative indicator when dollars are up.
Fair enough. All right. I won't beat up on foundations too much then. All right, Matt, let's bring you in. Let's talk about this free to give index, which I think is just a really fascinating study. Talk to us about the theory behind it, big picture, just to ground us in it, and then I've got some questions.
Yeah. So, the basic idea here, it comes straight out of economics, which is that, we know that institutions matter. We know that incentives matter. We know that in the private sphere, there's a long and growing literature that suggests that when people are allowed to make their own economic choices, they tend to exchange more, and you tend to see greater prosperity. And so the idea of this index is to sort of apply what we already know in the private exchange market to the nonprofit world and the charity world and see if incentives matter there as well. And so what we did was, we first kind of started, let's just think big picture. What are the types of things that might affect charitable behavior and incentives? Because if you're a donor and you want to make the world a better place, you have choices in terms of how you can spend your activity. And the more difficult it is to give, then one would think that you're probably going to give less, or you're definitely going to give less in those states that make it more difficult. And similarly, if you are a charity, you're trying to start a charity, the more difficult it is to get registered, to pay the fees, pay the startup fees, to pay the compliance costs, to hire people to help you fundraise, then again, those incentives matter. So the broad index is constructed from 33 different variables, and we divide those into three broad categories, which some of these are then you could even think of the number as even larger because some of these have many subcomponents. But the broad areas are one, what's the broad policy environment? The thinking here is that if it's if there's greater economic freedom in the state, then the capital that is needed to make charities possible, it's going to be harder to raise. It's going to be more difficult to create, that kind of surplus value that can then be turned into charitable giving. So we have one, the broad policy environment, and then the second branch of the index really focuses in on charitable freedom. And it's got several subcomponents. It's the largest part of this index. That looks at what are the registration fees in order to start a charity. What are the incorporation fees? What kind of reporting requirements are there? What kind of annual fees are there? Then it looks at what are the paid solicitor requirements? Are they required to register? Do they have to post bonds? Do they have to make regular reports to the state? Are there audit thresholds? Things like that. And then the third part of the index sort of looks at the incentives and the protections afforded to donors. So are there donor disclosure requirements that, potentially, require donors to have to reveal who they are and, their jeopardize their privacy? Is there donor standing? Are there charitable deductions? That sort of thing. So we basically, it sounds a little complicated, but honestly, when it comes down to it, it's just an exercise in averaging. So we gather all this data for these 33 variables. We average them by these three broad categories, and then we average those categories together, and we now have a measure to see how easy is it to engage in charity. What do the institutions and the laws in the state make it difficult or easy to engage in charity? It shows that some states make it much easier to engage in charitable activity, and some make it much more difficult. So let's start with the bad side. So California comes in at 50th, followed the next lowest is New Jersey, and then Washington, New York, Connecticut, Illinois. So in these states, the incentives to give are much more attenuated because it's just difficult to start charities, to run charities, to use paid solicitors, and then it's difficult for donors to feel that their interests are protected. At the other end of the spectrum, the number one state in terms of freedom to give is Montana, followed by Wyoming, South Dakota, Iowa, Indiana, and Texas. So in these states, charitable startup regulations are comparatively few and relatively low. It's easy to get going. It's easy to keep operating. Donors are face good incentives and are relatively well protected. So, that's kind of the broad overview. But then, the next question is, okay, well, does it matter? How does this affect actual activity? And this is where I think it gets pretty interesting because, I was telling a friend earlier that when you do something like this, you've got 33 variables, you spend months and months gathering it and trying to think through what's the best, what are probably the most relevant, and then you cross your fingers. You hope that you have spent your time wisely and that you've actually been studying something that matters, because you could then compare it to the real world and find out, oh, none of this stuff matters at all. And thankfully, that's not what we found. So we then gathered data on the number of charities per $1 billion of GDP, and what we find is that it's highly correlated with the index. So just to take one example, if you look at the top 5 state, performing states in our index, there are twice as many charities per $1 billion of GDP in those states, 121.8, relative to the bottom 5 states, which is 63.2. So what we find is that, the essential lesson of economics, which is that incentives matter, also applies to charitable activity. Incentives matter when it comes to charity and charitable.
Yeah, I think this is the big takeaway to me, and maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, but there are more charities, which means more people are being helped in a more diverse set of ways in the places where the regulations are a little lighter. And in the places where government is like, well, let's put this rule in, put that rule out. You're right. Incentives matter and people just have fewer charities. And what happens when there's fewer charities? It means the government has to step into the breach. And so it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle of government getting more powerful as it regulates more because people just abandon the field. Is that a fair description of what you found?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think that's one of the ways we could actually, to me, that seems like a perfectly rational hypothesis. I think that's one of the next steps in terms of research is somebody can take our index and see how do governments now get involved in this space in terms of their own, taking on normal activities that we think of as charitable activities. One could also use it. There's people who believe that we need more regulations on charities. Well, it's my hope that somebody will take the index and study what are the things that those people are concerned about. They're worried about fraud or something like that. Well, let's see. Is that correlated with it? Because we now have evidence that there's downsides to greater regulation and more red tape for charities. Let's compare it with the other hypotheses that are out there.
And you also are lead scholar, or at least part of the State Economic Freedom Index. Is that right?
Yes, I'm a co-author. I'm not going to claim to be lead scholar, but yeah. So and this is actually part of this index is the Economic Freedom in North America index. So what we're doing there is looking at how easy is it for do states make it for people to make their own economic choices?
So do you see some correlation in the giving index with the state freedom index?
We do. Now, some of that correlation is by construction because the broad, free to give index is actually one portion of it is made from the Economic Freedom in North America index. But the interesting thing is we also kind of decompose that to see, okay, how do different types of incentives and freedoms relate to one another? And they're all highly correlated. So a state that imposes more restrictions on businesses makes it more difficult for private for-profit businesses to get started, that has higher taxes, that sort of thing. Also tends to make it more difficult for charities to get started. They have more regulations, higher fees, greater reporting requirements, make it more difficult to employ paid solicitors and that sort of thing. So this tells us that there's quite a bit of sort of spillover that when governments move to perhaps restrict economic freedoms, it ends up sort of one way or another also restricting private sector charitable.
Now, you're focused on the states, and we're going to come back to this kind of state regulatory environment. But Claudia, at the national level, are you seeing any legislative threats out there that could make it harder for givers nationally?
Yeah, actually. So I think what's an interesting tie-in here is, Justice Brandeis famously said that states are the laboratory for democracy, right? So you can take what we found in the index and make some, some guesses about what that might do federally, informed guesses, shall we say. And so just last week, House Ways and Means heard three bills that are extremely concerning to me as someone who wants to see a thriving philanthropic sector. All three bills are well intended, honestly, and hats off to the authors, well intended to stop foreign influence in American society, stop some shenanigans that are going on with folks breaking the law through violent protests, just stop some really bad stuff that's going on. But these bad things are few and far between when compared to the 1.5 million charities that exist in the United States, like 88% of which have less than $500,000 in annual spend. So you've got this huge sector, and we're going after a few bad actors, and they're bad actors and they have to be stopped. But some of these changes are significant. Two of the most concerning bills are intended to capture the nationality of all givers. So each charity would have to ask everyone, even if they throw 25 cents in a fountain or put $5 in a Salvation Army kettle, they'd need to ask their nationality, which means they need to know the identities. It would end anonymous giving, both bills. And they're concerning, and they passed on a straight party line vote out of committee last week. Those are concerning to me. They really hit at the heart of this tension that we feel sometimes in the public square about transparency versus privacy. And we always say privacy, right, at the roundtable. And though they're not asking for the names of the donors to be disclosed to the government, just aggregate nationalities, unless they come from a country of concern, the fact that now the charity has to collect and we can no longer give anonymously, that's concerning. I mean, I like to give to my alma mater, and I don't like the phone calls at night by the earnest college students that are trying to bring in more for the annual fund. And so I give anonymously to my alma mater, for example. This bill would prevent that. These two bills, actually.
What's the point of finding the nationality? What is the problem that in search of a solution there?
Again, they're seeking out foreign actors that are, trying to infiltrate society. We've seen that a little bit in elections. There's some talk of it being infused into the data center debate. Whatever it is, it's very few folks who are giving money allegedly through charitable institutions to then work on issue campaigns. And so they're trying to find out who those individuals are, or stop that, or disincentivize that. But what that's going to do is it's going to dry up a lot of small dollar giving, quite honestly, completely. A lot of anonymous giving. Has huge ramifications, and it's challenging to help members of the committee, help the authors, help member of Congress see that when they're looking at these headlines about these few bad apples that are out there.
Yeah, it's a reminder. If it's a party line vote, that means it's the Republicans leading it, and so it's just a reminder that both sides have bad ideas when it comes to all this stuff, which is disappointing. Matt, in your research at the state level, the states that are really not doing great, were there any particular regulations or rules or any of those many factors that you were looking at that really had the greatest negative impact that states that currently don't have them should make sure that they don't accidentally impose?
So, one of the things that makes it tricky to answer that question is that so many good things go together and so many bad things go together. So it's difficult to kind of isolate that out and say, what is the defining factor here? And some of this goes back to the fact that we were somewhat to our surprise, like if you have generally generally high levels of economic freedom, so the broad policy environment is good. It turns out the donor confidence subindex also tends to be good. It turns out that the charitable freedom portion, the charity startup stuff, also tends to be relatively good. So it's kind of difficult to isolate that. And what you tend to find is, like, if a state has really minimal registration requirements, low fees, sort of thing, then they also tend to make it easy for donors to protect their own privacy, have standing, that sort of thing. So it's kind of an empirical problem, because it's an empirical problem, but it's a good problem because it means good things go with good things, bad things go with bad things, if that makes sense.
Was there anything innovative, anything that you saw in the data that some state or maybe a small handful of states are doing that was really creative?
Well, one thing that I found pretty interesting that I think is actually something that we could take from we should be measuring more broadly, not just in the charitable context, is this idea that new regulations need to be approved by the actual legislature, which to me sounds like, boy, that's a good idea. That seems like a good idea for any republic to, if you impose a requirement on the citizens, it seems like it should have to go through elected officials rather than just be something that the executive can impose. So, that's a good example where we can take I think the spirit of this index and even think about it more broadly as something that is just good governance.
Yeah. What are, from both of you, at the federal and state level, folks, donors, organizations that are working on policy, think tanks, advocacy groups, what are some of those ideal legislative changes that they should be arguing for?
I can go first on that. I'm a native Hoosier, so proud to see my state represented in the top 5 states. But we don't provide donor standing for donors and donor intent cases. So I've been urging those here in my home state to consider adopting model legislation that exists to do just that, give standing, that's all it does, to those who are the donor or who are the designee of the donor, to ensure that the charity is utilizing the dollars in the way intended, or if there's a need to shift those dollars, shifting them in a way that aligns with the donor's values. I think that's incredibly important, probably one of the most important things.
So the way I like to answer this question is think in terms of what are the incentives. We started this conversation talking about the incentives of economic actors and charitable givers, but what are the incentives of policymakers? And one of the overwhelming things, and I found in my career, is that the incentive of most policymakers is to not rock the boat. They are very, very risk averse. No offense to great policymakers, but they are often, they typically don't have a real entrepreneurial mindset. And so one of the advantages of an index like this is to help them see, look, you're not standing out on a limb here. You can do what these other states have done. Here's the model, look at it and follow it because it seems to work. So, I'll point to Montana, which is at the top of the index. So what is it that makes Montana at the top of this index? Well, they have no registration requirements. They have $0 filing fees, minimal reporting requirements for charities and for fundraising professionals. They have no audit requirements. They tend to have a really good overall policy environment with high degrees of economic freedom, generally favorable regulatory and tax regimes. They tend to have nation-leading incentives and protections for donors themselves. They offer donor standing. They're generally deductible contributions. So they essentially tick quite a few of these boxes. They tend to have a large number of charities per $1 billion. And as far as I know, there are no significant downsides with, extraordinary scandals going on with charities doing, terrible things, or some of the stuff that Claudia was talking about with foreigners influencing, elections or anything like that. So, my advice is just look outside the window and look at what other states like Montana are doing. And if you like what you see, like, you can copy that. And there's no reason why other states can't follow that model, can't follow Justice Brandeis's advice and look to the other states as laboratories of democracy and copy what works.
It's interesting because Montana, if I'm not mistaken, is as open as it might be on the charitable side, is very restrictive on the political giving side. It's got a super low cap of what you can give, and there's a lot of regulations around that. So it's an interesting that both can exist in both states. So you could be super restrictive on one side, and versus where I am in Virginia, where there is no cap, and so the political restrictions are much lower. Interesting. I don't know if there's any.
Well, and that's interesting. That's a good reason for trying to measure as many things as we can, because we do sometimes see that every so often. Like, sometimes states that have very high fiscal burdens, high taxes, have relatively low regulations, and vice versa. So it's important to kind of capture as much of it as you can.
So what do we think? Here we are in 2026. The stock market seems to still be doing well. Claudia, are you optimistic we're going to continue to see more growth nationwide? And I guess the more important question is there anything more we can do other than maybe just that tax credit to bring in those medium and smaller dollar donors back into the philanthropic fold?
Yeah, I'm highly optimistic in giving overall. It's, what makes America great. It's what separates us for so many other countries around the world. We were founded on this whole idea of voluntary society. That's who we are. And so I bet on America, and I bet on Americans, and I'm optimistic.
And Matt, what do you think the next step is for your research? It sounds like there's more things to unpack there. Is the roundtable or some other groups going to take it and kind of take it to that next evolutionary step?
Well, so one of the things that I enjoy about doing these types of indices is it's a very leveraged way to sort of understand the world. So we've been at Fraser been publishing the Economic Freedom of the World Index. This will be the 30th year. The Economic Freedom of North America. This will be the 20th year. And these indices, we put them out there, and other scholars have then used them. So, they've been cited some 16,000 times, but more important, they've been used over 1,000 times by researchers to study the effect of economic freedom on outcomes of interest. So we know, thanks to this research, we can say quite definitively that states and countries with greater degrees of economic freedom have higher income, less poverty, faster growth, more charity, actually, greater levels of happiness, even cleaner environments. So, when you introduce a new index like this, would be my great hope is to see other scholars take it up and ask all sorts of questions. We asked one question: when you're freer to give, do you tend to see more charitable formation? And the answer seems to be yes. But I could see plenty of other questions that researchers could be asking. I mentioned earlier, the idea of are there greater scandals, or is there greater nefarious activity? Well, now we actually have the data, and it would be possible for people to measure that and take that up. The other thing that I hope to do, should the Philanthropy Roundtable be interested, is I want to continue this research and put it out every few years, so that we then have a barometer measuring it over time, so that we can see our states shifting, because that's where it does get really interesting. And then what's great is when you get to the stage where you're not calling policymakers or writing op-eds trying to encourage policymakers to improve their environment, they're calling you and saying, what can we do to improve our environment? We know about your index. We know that this affects, people's charitable activity. How do we make, New Jersey into the next Montana? That's where I think it starts to get, really.
Well, as I said at the top, there's not enough discussion around philanthropy in our just daily conversations. There's so much else that gets drowned out. But if we want to keep America, as you say, Claudia, as this shining beacon for philanthropy and this really unique position in the world, we do have to talk about it. We have to know what's limiting it, what's encouraging it, and actually tell people, hey, philanthropy is a great thing. You should be involved. You should give, even if you can only give $100 a year, even if you only give $25 a year. Do it. Because it will make you happier. It will accrue to your benefit, accrue to society's benefit. And when we have good facts to do that, when we know where we stand, and with new research like what, Matt, you've put out, I should say, along with your co-author, Jack Salmon, it's really important and helps us understand the landscape so that people like us who actually do think about philanthropy on some daily basis can go and be cheerleaders for this really important cause. Well, Claudia, Matt, really appreciate you both coming on and talking about these things. And I encourage everyone to just keep giving because it's really important. So thank you both.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, as you can probably imagine, I think philanthropy is really important, and I want more and more people to give. And it's great to have the Giving USA numbers to be able to give us a benchmark of where we stand in terms of our giving as a nation. But it's also really important to understand what are the limits to that? What stops us from being even more generous than we might be? And I'm thrilled about the research that Matt Mitchell and Jack Salmon have done on behalf of the Roundtable to look at all these different states, understand what the gaps are, who's doing well, who's doing poorly, and try to suss some of that out. And it sounds like the next step is really to apply some of that, to leverage that research. And this is a role for the state think tanks, for the national think tanks, for groups like Philanthropy Roundtable, for even groups like Donors Trust, and for you as a donor to speak to elected officials if you happen to talk to one, and advocate for fewer rules, really, that will allow more people to get engaged with philanthropy. That is how we create the civil society that we really care about. That's how we live out the promise of the Declaration of Independence that we celebrate this year, and the goals of the Constitution. So maybe that's all high-minded, but that's kind of how I think about it. We want to be high-minded. That's what philanthropy really does. So a big thank you to Claudia, a big thank you to Matt for joining us and talking through these things. And big thank you to you for listening in and for caring about this, because it matters. It's really important. And we love at Donors Trust to be a vehicle for helping donors to give in a way that's simpler, that's tax advantaged, but really, most importantly, allows you to have the impact with your philanthropy that you want to have. And so if you are already working with us, you can always give us a call. We're always happy to talk through ideas, be a sounding board, be helpful to you in your giving. And if you aren't working with Donors Trust, if you don't have a donor advised fund with us, then you can roll it over from another provider or just open up a fund at any time. We'd be delighted to work with you and be a partner in your philanthropy. We'll be back with some other unique topics coming up soon. I can't wait to share those with you. Until then, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.